Sarah parked in her usual spot outside the hospital, staring at the tired reflection in her rearview mirror. Her hair, once neatly pulled back, had fallen into loose strands around her face, and she quickly gathered them into a messy bun. The morning with Max and Lily had been a brief respite, but now reality was back in full force. With a deep breath, she stepped out of the car, her feet heavy as she made her way toward the entrance. The automatic doors slid open, and the familiar sterile smell of antiseptic and faint coffee hit her. Sarah's steps quickened as she made her way to the staff room to clock in.
Sarah, thank God you're here.
Carmen said, pulling her aside.
We've got a situation.
Sarah raised an eyebrow, her heart sinking. What now?
Mandy called off last minute. We're already short-staffed, and now you'll have to cover her haul on top of your own. I'm sorry, I know it's a lot, but there's no one else.
Of course, Sarah thought, suppressing a groan. This wasn't the first time someone had called off a shift. The hospital was perpetually understaffed, and those left behind always had to pick up the slack. But today, after the warmth of the morning with her kids, the extra load felt heavier than usual. I'll manage, Sarah said, forcing a smile. She didn't have the luxury of saying no, not with bills piling up at home. Carmen gave her a grateful nod before rushing off to handle another crisis. Sarah grabbed her stethoscope and clipboard, her mind already racing through the list of tasks for the day. 2 halls of patients meant she'd be running non-stop. She made her way down the bustling corridor, nurses and doctors weaving in and out of rooms like clockwork. The faint beeping of monitors and the murmur of voices created a constant hum in the background, a soundtrack to the endless days of care and exhaustion. By the time Sarah finally reached her small office, she felt the weight of it all pressing down on her shoulders. She sat at her desk for a brief moment, allowing herself to exhale. Her eyes drifted to the framed photo sitting on the edge of her desk. It was a picture of Max and Lily, from when they were about 10, standing in front of the house, grinning ear to ear, their arms slung around each other's shoulders. The photo was faded, the edges a little worn from years of being handled, but it was her anchor. She smiled softly, tracing her finger along the edge of the frame. This was why she kept going. Why, despite the exhaustion, the never-ending shifts, and the relentless juggle of responsibilities, she couldn't stop. Max and Lily were her world, and their laughter that morning echoed in her mind. They were growing up so fast, and though they were becoming more independent, they still needed her. She straightened in her chair, the familiar resolve settling back into place. She had work to do. A soft knock at the door pulled Sarah from her thoughts. She looked up to see Nurse Dana poking her head in.
Sarah, Mrs. Cameron's asking for you again. She's been going on about the universe, sending her a message all morning.
Sarah sighed but smiled. Mrs. Cameron had been a patient in the long-term care wing for several weeks now. She was an older woman with bright, curious eyes and a penchant for philosophical musings. She often claimed to get messages from the universe, offering strange but somehow insightful remarks about life, fate, and connection. Most of the staff dismissed her as eccentric, if not outright delusional, but Sarah found something oddly comforting in her ramblings.
I'll be there in a minute,
Sarah replied, standing up and grabbing her clipboard. She made her way down the hall to Mrs. Cameron's room, where the old woman sat upright in her bed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her white hair was pulled back into a bun, and her eyes sparkled with a knowing that seemed to transcend her frail body.
Ah, Sarah, I knew you'd come.
Of course, Mrs. Cameron. How are you feeling today?
Sarah asked, checking the monitor by her bedside.
I'm well, dear, but I've had another message. The universe is talking again. It's telling me that we're all connected, you see? Like threads in a great tapestry. Every action, every choice, it ripples out and touches everyone else. Even you, Sarah. You and your children.
Sarah paused, her hand hovering over the monitor's buttons.
My children?
Yes, they're growing, aren't they? Becoming strong, independent. But they are connected to you, just as you are connected to the world. Don't forget that. No one is alone, not truly.
Sarah smiled, though she felt a slight chill at the accuracy of Mrs. Cameron's words.
I won't forget. Thank you, Mrs. Cameron.
The old woman nodded, her gaze distant, as if seeing something far beyond the hospital walls.
You're doing well, Sarah. Better than you think. But remember, the universe is always watching, always guiding. You just have to listen.
Sarah patted Mrs. Cameron's hand gently before turning to leave. As she walked down the hall, Mrs. Cameron's words lingered in her mind. She couldn't quite explain it, but there was a truth in what the old woman said, a reminder that even in the hardest moments, she wasn't truly alone. The day stretched ahead of her, and she still had 2 halls of patients to care for. But Sarah found herself standing a little taller, her steps a little lighter. She wasn't just doing this for herself, but for Max, for Lily, and for something larger than she could fully understand. And that thought, strange as it was, gave her the strength to keep going. As Sarah left Mrs. Cameron's room, the soft hum of the hospital receded into the background. But in the corner of the room, something strange was happening. A faint glow began to radiate, unseen by either Sarah or the staff bustling through the halls. It pulsed gently, in time with Mrs. Cameron's slow, steady heartbeat, its glow growing brighter with each beat. Mrs. Cameron remained still, her eyes half closed, but her lips curved into a knowing smile. The light seemed to dance around her, rippling outward as if reaching for something beyond the walls of the hospital. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet the energy in the room shifted, a quiet force moving through the air. The glow flickered once more, expanding ever so slightly before fading into the background, its journey far from over. The scene cut to Max, sprawled across the couch at home. His long legs stretched out in front of him, one arm draped over the back of the couch, the other holding his phone. The TV in front of him flickered with the evening news, though his attention drifted in and out. The anchor droned on about the economy, local events, and a minor car crash downtown, but Max barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, still chewing over the conversation he'd had with Lily that morning. His eyes wandered to the stack of bills on the table, now neatly tucked under a coaster, but the weight of them remained. He needed to figure out where to apply for that job. Somewhere close, somewhere that would fit around school. But for now, the comfort of the couch and the soft hum of the TV kept him planted where he was, at least for a few more minutes. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Lily rummaged through the freezer, letting out a triumphant aha as she pulled out a hidden pint of ice cream. She smiled to herself, pleased that her stash had gone undiscovered by her mom. She loved Sarah dearly, but when it came to sweets, there was no shame in hiding a little extra for herself. With a spoon already in hand, Lily popped the lid off and scooped out a bite, savouring the creamy chocolate flavour as it melted on her tongue. She closed the freezer door, leaning against the counter as she ate, her mind replaying the same conversation Max had been thinking about. She didn't mind getting a job. She actually kind of liked the idea, but the thought of her mum working so hard while they barely did anything to help, that was starting to bother her more than she realised. She paused mid-scoop, her eyes narrowing in thought. Suddenly, the light in the corner of Mrs. Cameron's hospital room flickered again, sending out another ripple, and across town, Max felt an odd shiver run down his spine. He frowned, shifting slightly on the couch. At the same moment, Lily, mid-bite, stopped, a strange warmth filling the room for just an instant. She blinked, looking around, but everything appeared normal.
That was weird.
She muttered, shaking her head before taking another spoonful of ice cream. Back at the hospital, Mrs. Cameron's heartbeat slowed into a peaceful rhythm. The unseen light faded once again, quiet but lingering, as if waiting for something else.